This is a podcast by Householders Options to Protect the Environment, Hope Australia. We are a community environmental education and capacity building organisation based in Toowoomba, southeast Queensland, Australia. This is a podcast in the series Eco-Social Work in Australia. It was produced for Hope Australia in Toowoomba, Queensland, on and adjacent to the traditional lands of the Djarawar, Gayabal, Yugara and Waka Waka peoples. Hope pays respect to the past, present and emerging leaders of all First Nations people in this country and acknowledges the unique contribution that their cultures make to contemporary Australia. Hello, my name is Andrew Nicholson and I'm the producer of the Eco-Social Work in Australia podcast series. In Australia, the catastrophic 2019 to 2020 bushfire season and the extremely destructive East Coast flooding events of early 2022 are the latest examples of so-called natural disaster weather events, which we know have now been made more frequent and intense in terms of their impact due to background global heating and associated climate change. The social work response to such disasters, with their myriad physical environmental impacts, is already exercising the talents of social workers in this country and forms a key interest of my next guest in the podcast series. That guest is Professor Margaret Alston, AM, OAM, who has developed a long-standing research and teaching interest around the social work role as it may respond to natural disasters, and particularly regarding the differential gendered experience of such disaster impacts amongst women, men and children. She has taught and conducted research within a number of premier Australian universities over the years on topics such as the links between rural life and gender, and has grounded that work in action research based upon first-hand observation of some of the most vulnerable communities in the world. Professor Alston has applied her research insights to the benefit of a wide spectrum of institutions and individuals, from acting as a gender expert consultant to international agencies such as the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization and the Commission for the Status of Women, to providing doctoral research supervision to a new generation of social workers, helping equip them with the tools to focus on gender inequities within social research. In this episode, we talk about Professor Alston's abiding interest in the gendered experience of environmental impacts, how such physical environment influences are directly relevant to mainstream social work practice, and how her research and social work training insights apply with particular relevance to our own Asia-Pacific region of the world. So welcome, Professor Alston. It's an absolute pleasure to talk with you today.
Thank you. It's it's wonderful to be here and to be talking to you and to be recording on this topic.
Well, let's start the conversation by asking you to introduce yourself more fully. Can you give us some of the milestones of your very extensive career and also some insights into why, when and how you first developed your keen interest in the differential gendered experience of disaster impacts relevant to the social work context?
That's a big question, and I could give you a really big answer, but I'll try and pull it in. But essentially, my interest comes from the fact that I was brought up on a family farm, and when my father died young, my mum ran the farm. So I guess I always had this interest in gender and agriculture because I could see what was going on around me. I then sort of married into a farm, and we had a large farm. At the same time, I worked at University. Now, all of these things sort of tended to come together because when the drought hit in 1996, and it continued right through until about 2010, it was obvious to me that what was going on around me in my own community was very much a tragedy and a disaster. But the focus of the discourse around the drought at the time was very much about the economy and about the environment. So economic and environmental disaster, but very limited. In fact, no attention to the social dimensions of what I was seeing around me, in my neighbours, in my community, and certainly in the more general region and across the country, really. So my research developed around this original analysis of mine that we didn't have a focus on the social, and we really, really needed it. So this sort of built on the fact that I had a background where, I'd seen women very much heavily engaged in agriculture. That wasn't coming through. The drought hit, there were social implications. And at the same time, I'd recently completed my PhD on the invisibility of farm women based on my earlier experiences. So when I was looking at the social impacts of the drought, which to me at that time was a drought, but I hadn't put it into the lexicon of climate change or disaster at the time. But my PhD was on the invisibility of farm women. And so gender became a very much a top of the mind concept when I was looking at the drought impacts. And just to sort of take that a little bit further, I was working at University, and I was doing a lot of my research through the Centre for Rural Social Research. Jeff Lawrence was in charge at the time, and he was one of Australia's leading sociologists. Over time, I became the director of the centre, and I was very switched on then around rural and agricultural issues. And then I guess the final step in that journey was when I was coaxed to Monash and spent time there as Professor of Social Work over the next 10 years. Then my interest in this area, it didn't go away. It became much more global, and it fitted into the discourse that was developing around climate change and disasters across the world. So I was able to see from my embryonic experience with the drought how that then emerged into my more global interest in climate change, disasters, and of course, gender was top of the mind still in all of that. So a lot of my research then took me to a number of countries, to India, to the Pacific, to Bangladesh, to Laos, PDR. So I was seeing the evidence of environmental disasters across a range of circumstances, a range of countries. And in all of that, I could see that making gender visible was really critical to how we should interpret what climate change was doing.
Thank you very much for that. That, really interesting. I mean, I'm just taking a couple of points out of that, noting that direct lived experience of coming up through the rural environment, in effect, the rural sector. I mean, as with some other speakers in this series, some of their early interest in the sort of issues that they went on to deal with at a professional level, coming from that sort of early background. Ironically enough, interestingly enough, I don't know how significant you see this, but just to make the point, you were looking at there, in terms of your early research and social work interests, a lack of focus on the social, which is in some ways quite ironic when you bring this sort of back to an eco-social work sort of narrative, in a sense that where the view is that the social person in environment sort of metaphor has had too much focus in some, from some viewpoints.
Well, actually, that's an interesting point. And the reason I got really engaged and extended my research around, social work's response was because, we were very much wedded to the concept of person in the environment, was very much a social environment at the time. And my increasing interest in social work elements of this research was to incorporate the environment as part of our person in environment. The physical environment needed to be part of our discourse in social work. So that's where I came from with that.
And I think just sort of building on that somewhat, again, that very much that rural sector seems to have been one of the, if not the breeding grounds for interest around that the environmental connection, I suppose, because of that obvious connection with people on the land who they have the direct lived experience of environmental factors all the time, perhaps more so than people in an urban setting. But the rural sector, social work connected to rural issues, social work connected to indigenous issues, seems to have been some of the areas where eco-social work practice has gained an early sort of foothold in a sense. Just thinking of other speakers in this series like Dr. Heather Downey talking about water security, again having direct contact to that sort of rural sector set of interests.
Yeah. Well, the other critical point that I should make is that I did a lot of work through the Food and Ag Organization, the UN FAO. When I say a lot of work, I was invited over there as a gender expert in early 2000s to, and this being the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, they were very keen on understanding the gender elements in that context. And so that was another trigger for me to become much more internationally engaged. And I subsequently went on and worked for UN Habitat, looking at gender and climate change. And we did some training with the United Nations Environment Programme in Geneva. And during that period, in around 2008, I think, I was chosen as the Australian representative at Commission for the Status of Women meeting that year, because the focus was on gender and rural issues. So a lot of things came together, and it was that internationalizing of the agenda that was really critical. And then the need to bring that into the social work lexicon was really important.
Well, let's now, drill down a bit further on this to come to the sort of first substantive question on eco-social work practice. But, also I know that you, as you've just already indicated, you're going to touch significantly at various points on the differential gendered experience context of that. But what for you, the question being, what for you is the meaning, significance or relevance of an eco-social work approach, linked to differential gendered experience or however you want to frame that? What is the relevance of such an approach to mainstream social work practice in 2022?
Well, it's interesting that we're having this conversation at this particular time when we're being subjected to unprecedented flooding in New South Wales. And that's on the back of incredible fires in the previous summer. So I think any social workers listening to this would be thinking, yes, well, social work is deeply engaged in these issues. So linking social work to climate change is not very difficult anymore. But in my view, the significance of an eco-social work response or approach is that we have to be very conscious of those links between the social and the environment. And so environmental degradation and the impacts of climate change are going to have incredible impacts on the people that we work with and the people in these areas, and the need for us to understand that the impacts of climate change are not the same for everybody. They're much more intense for those living in poverty, for example. We know that women are particularly vulnerable, children are particularly vulnerable, those in rural areas are particularly vulnerable, families are particularly vulnerable, and then older women are particularly vulnerable. People living with disabilities are very vulnerable. So there's a whole lot of factors wrapped around how social work needs to understand, and social work practice needs to incorporate this understanding of the impacts of disasters so that we're ready to support people. In research that we've been doing on how social workers responded to COVID, for example, which obviously is not a climate change element, but it gives us a really good example of a major disaster. And the big issues that came out of that, and I think we're seeing that also in the floods, is things like homelessness, increasing, and financial stress increasing, and health and mental health issues becoming very, escalating. And the other thing is violence against women, and family violence rising. We're finding that in all of the disasters that we've been looking at, is this increase in violence. So we have to understand not only that climate change is relevant to us, but the factors that result from a climate disaster, how we need to respond to those. What are the major factors? How are we going to readdress and reshape social work in response to these events? And how are we going to ensure that we're not sidelined in that process, that they're part of decision-making bodies that are addressing these big, big issues? So they're just some of my top of the mind thoughts. Just a couple of additional points. We're starting to see new types of issues like eco-anxiety amongst people, which is that anxiety that people have about another disaster in the same way that they've experienced might come. And I'm sure the people of Lismore could understand exactly what I mean by eco-anxiety. And the other one that we may need to come to terms with is solastalgia, which is that real emotional, mental response to seeing our much-loved environment changed irreparably. Solastalgia was a term coined during the drought to explain the mental health impacts of the drought and people seeing their environment change and erode. But it's a factor that we see in all disasters. And if you can just think about the current floods, will you understand what we mean by that, seeing your familiar environment changed irreparably. So there's a number of factors for social workers to get their heads around.
Thanks very much for that, Margaret. I again, just picking out a few points there, bringing it always back in terms of my interest within this series to eco-social work principles, if you like. But the last point there, you've just pointed to this idea of the wicked problems, the interleaved, interconnected problems that come out of, for instance, that last commentary about the psychological impacts of extreme weather events, like the floods, the recent East Coast floods, the social determinants of health, the impacts of these factors like solastalgia, eco-anxiety onto the mental health, and therefore to some extent the physical health of people impacted by these issues. Very interesting to hear that reference to, I think it was originally possibly Professor Glenn Albrecht's work on solastalgia. Exactly right. But that whole, that term of psychoterratic illness, a neologism, but certainly making that connection, like at the psychological level, of the social determinants of health. I mean, so this is another reason. Well, I suppose it goes to that sort of equation of between social justice and environmental justice, those direct connections. You have to be concerned with the environmental side of stuff if you're going to be concerned with the social well-being, ultimately, of clients. And also that reference you made to COVID-19, which again, is considered ultimately as a physical environmental stressor, because the views are that this pandemic, the viral spread, and it's not just that virus, but these things are made more likely by disruption and damage to natural areas such as forests and other sort of natural areas in various parts of the world, that makes it more likely that human populations will come into contact with vectors that are carrying these viruses, whereas before there wouldn't have been so much contact. So again, just making that point, here is a physical environmental, originating as a physical environmental stressor that's having a whole range of both physical and mental health impacts in the population. Look, you already started setting up there before the commentary about the gendered links to environmental impacts. So let's now drill down a bit further there and ask you to just dip further into your very extensive research, teaching and placement experience, to talk a bit more about this issue of gendered sensitivity within social work intervention. So the question might be, how might a more evolved gendered sensitivity within social work interventions help tackle some of the key international sustainability challenges? For example, global heating and climate disruption, linked gendered violence, growing socio-economic inequality, or other environment and social justice linked challenges.
Okay, so incorporating gender is, in my view, it's actually really basic. It's like level one. Let's get down and understand this. I'll just give you an example. So I could give you so many examples, but when I went to Bangladesh, we did a 3-year study in Bangladesh. We took ourselves to what I would have thought would be amongst the most vulnerable areas in the world to climate change, and that was the Bay of Bengal. We looked at 3 different sites across Bangladesh. Each had experienced a different climate change impact. The major focus of our study was to look at gender's or implications of, what happens in a country that is hugely vulnerable, that is also not a wealthy country. And so we were able to observe a number of things, and I won't go into everything, obviously, but issues like, because of the disaster, that need to outmigrate. So family members, usually the husband, outmigrating, and women who then needed to look after their agricultural plots, to work in some way. And this is a society where women hadn't necessarily been working or outside the home. So having to then move into the workforce, into agricultural production, and, reliant on the income coming from the outmigrator. So what we were seeing is very challenging circumstances where people were adapting in various ways, and the impacts of those disasters on the families, and the need for women to be super engaged and change how they operated. And, there was often the need for them to take on extra care, and because their waterways had been corrupted by the disaster, then they were needing to walk further to collect water. There were so many things that rebounded into the household and for women. So, I mean, that to me was a very instructive analysis of the gendered impacts in those societies that we were looking at. Violence was an issue, poverty was an issue, the need for health services had been corrupted and access to those by lack of disaster, the need for transport systems when, roads and bridges had been destroyed. So, what I was seeing was very much the sorts of things I'd seen in Australia as well, but on a different scale. So in Australia, for example, during drought, you might have seen outmigration, yes, but it was often of the women in Australia. So women going off farm to work, even having to leave their community at times to get jobs in regional centres. So outmigration was a big thing. It was very gendered depending on the circumstances. And then across a number of countries where we did observe that violence was an issue. So that's one element of the gendered impacts and why we could see things going on there. More recent research we've done in relation to the bushfires, 2019-20 fires, for example. We've been looking at gendered impacts there as well on how farm family members have responded. And one of the really interesting things that's that's come out of that research is the differential ways that men and women have responded. And often we find that it's women who are moving into community organising and trying to get activities happening, getting community together to try and keep spirits high. I suspect the same thing is happening in Lismore, where this need for community organising is often done by women in those circumstances. Men, on the other hand, feel certainly the farm men that we've been talking to, keeping their troubles private is something that we've come across. So lots of reasons, I think, for us to have an understanding of those gendered experience. Oh, just one last thing I'll mention is in the heat waves that went across France in 2003, one of the findings of that particular research that was done after that terrible disaster, what they found was the most vulnerable people, the people who died in really large numbers, was older women living alone who couldn't afford air conditioning. So again, this issue of gender keeps rearing its head in very interesting ways, so that we're able to see the gendered complexity if we look at various disasters. And for that reason alone, we need to be very conscious of gender in our work in communities, in post-disaster, in climate change actions. We have to be very, very conscious of gender, because gender is very visible when you actually open your eyes to it.
Fascinating stuff. Very interesting to hear examples there, both from an Australian and international context of the research you've done and your colleagues have done, on the cascading effects, by the sounds of it. This is what I've taken from your comments, cascading effects of physical environmental impacts, and the way those effects are differentially distributed according to either the roles or the lifestyles of women and men, the differences that makes to their actual experience of those impacts. Look, I want to now move on as we go through this very, very interesting interview. I try to introduce a bit of what I term a critical dialogue into this series, basically to help reinforce a belief in the absolute importance of, working on innovative eco-social work approaches, however that is actually framed, to tackling the increasingly serious, interconnected environmental, social and economic wicked problems. We've already sort of referred to those. We're now facing as a globalized culture. Therefore, I ask each of my guests a variant of what you might term the so what question. In your case, this becomes, Margaret, why should the mainstream social work profession concern itself with differential gendered experience, and by extension, why should the mainstream here in Australia be concerned with tackling the sort of linked environmental and social justice frame problems we have been talking about so far?
Yeah, very interesting question questions, and they will take a very complex answer, I think. But I think if we're to understand the consequences of climate change and disasters on communities, then we really must understand the nuances of gender, equality, adaptations, how we can support communities in preparing for disasters, areas of mitigation. It's going to become a much more stronger part of social work practice, I think. And so I guess my response, my short answer to your question is that social work, it must position itself at the forefront of knowledge and activism around climate change and environmental disasters. It's really critical, because we can bring that social justice perspective and an environmental link to an environmental justice perspective to the global community, as well as to national actions and to local actions. And I think, if we don't understand yet that climate change is a major threat to the human population, it's really important that we start thinking that way. And we really must consciously adopt environmental justice and social justice in our practice, because that's, we're just simply going to have to support or understand it initially in our own environment and in our own community, and then, in the sort of disasters that are going to hit us as a country, and in global discussions about climate change and political responses to climate change. We really have to be active and informed interrogators in that space, but we also have to bring our knowledge into our practice so that we can be really informed in how we approach, disasters, post-disasters, climate change bearing down on us. It's critical, I think, that we do that. So, for me, it's been a really long journey from drought, family farming, to a global understanding of climate change and disasters. And I think we all have to make that journey and understand. We have to understand the politics of the global response to this, and really come to terms with that in not only the global but the local.
Thank you, Margaret, for giving such a strong, comprehensive and nuanced answer to that, perhaps obvious, but nonetheless relevant question. I think it needs to be asked and answered frequently, as perhaps you imply. Look, now as we move towards the end of this interview, I want to shift the focus towards the future. Nobody has a crystal ball, or these days, perhaps we should say nobody has the right algorithm to achieve exact predictions, at least not yet. Nonetheless, I ask each of my guests to dream creatively a little bit and offer some ideas on what the future could or should hold, in their view, for mainstream practice in light of their particular social work approaches and interests. So for you, the question might be, what could or should the short to mid-term future, say the next 2 to 10 years, hold for mainstream social work approaches which incorporate greater levels of differential gendered experience sensitivity as a practice frame, either in Australia, internationally, or both?
Okay, well, that's a very complex question, but let me answer it this way. I think in 10 years' time, we really need to have disaster social work as an important part of social work training. I think a few universities have it as an elective, but I think we need to have disaster social work front and centre, because that's something that we really need to incorporate into everybody's practice. How do you respond? How do you support communities? How do you look after yourself in a dangerous situation? That sort of thing. But then the other end of the scale is in that global environment where we need to be sure that social work is well represented in global exchanges and global development of knowledge in this area. I think that for example, the COP meetings, the Committee of Party meetings, very much still dominated by economics, and economics is important. We also need to have a much more informed dialogue at that level. And social work to be represented in all of those international forums, because we're going to be frontline workers. The other thing that I think is important to me is that social work needs to have a much higher profile in this area. We need to be on committees, on response units that are responding to disasters, and I think we need to build on that from incorporating into universities as a subject, but then building on that so that we have social workers working across areas of disaster, potentially places like Resilience New South Wales, and so from that local to the national and then international. It's really important that social work steps up into that, because we really need to be amongst the decision makers. We really need to be represented around the table around these issues. because, my own journey of stumbling into social impacts from a very low base and then becoming fixated on this for my entire career is indicative, I think, of where social workers currently find themselves, surrounded by often quite extreme disasters and stumbling forward and going, how do we respond to this? So we need to have a platform, we need to build that, we need to build our profile, and we need to have an international response that is globally relevant. We need to be on the COP Australian delegations. We need to be in there and we need to be responding. And I think in all of that, we need to have this subtle understanding of gender and the differential impacts on people across countries, etc. So that's a fairly long-winded answer, and I hope that you drew something from that, Andrew.
Well, Margaret, it wasn't long-winded, it was excellent, but you could argue the question was far too long-winded in the first place. But anyway, but look, just taking a few things from that, I just note, one thing is this is not a particular professional observation, but this has been echoed by other speakers in this series. The profession as a whole, that is social work, needs to get in there, get active, get real, however you want to phrase it. But that is now in the context of the recognition, just thinking of some of the IPCC, most recent IPCC report, which is echoing other voices from around the world. All of the professions, all of the sectors of society have a role to play. In our field, allied professions such as public health, psychology are getting into the mix. And so does the social work profession as a whole needs to get in there, active and into the mix. And you think again of at an international level, the IFSW's theme for this year's World Social Work Day events and the conference coming up at the end of June, co-building a new eco-social world, leaving nobody behind. I mean, there in the title is the implication that we all need to be getting on with it. But of course, there is the challenge, isn't it? I mean, it's one thing to know what we need to do, which seems to be a very common theme today. We know what we need to do to start co-building that world, but it's the challenge is overcoming the constraints, the blockages, the mindsets, whatever you might say, the political sort of lethargy, however you want to frame it. But thank you very much for that. And look, that basically, as we come really to the end of this very rich interview, I mean, we've covered a wide span of topics, and they've all been linked to the value of eco-social work practice and the value of a differential gendered lens within that eco-social work turn. But on that sort of basis that, people remember the beginning and ends of presentations, I ask each guest to try and do the impossible, which is to sum up, in a few sentences, perhaps, or give some insights, to summarize their messages throughout the actual interview. So to take away, for the benefit of listeners as they go away from the podcast, do you have a short take-home message or one key idea from your conversation today that to some extent encapsulates your overall stance?
That's a really difficult thing to do, but let me try and encapsulate it this way. So I think we're all in some ways touched by a disaster, whether it's simply reading about the floods in Lismore and feeling absolutely challenged by those, or whether it's a little bit more personal like it was for me in farming and seeing, the gendered aspects of that and the lack of understanding of those within, within the context of drought and so forth. We all have some sort of a way where we're brushing up against these big, wicked problems that we're experiencing now. We have to bring that understanding or that awakening that we have into our practice, and we have to understand how we can do that. Now, there'll be a lot of people out there going, well, where do I start? And I guess, I think you mentioned something earlier in the interview. The IPCC report, the latest IPCC report, is a good way to understand the more global understanding of this issue. But perhaps in the more immediate community sphere, you can be looking at ways that you can assist your community to prepare for disasters and to be much more or much less vulnerable, as it were, in various ways. So I think social work practice is going to have to incorporate those sorts of strategies in the future. Community work where we're addressing and preparing, undertaking disaster preparedness. We're aware of people in our communities who may be vulnerable in particular situations. Developing vulnerability registers where people can register themselves if they're feeling that they may need help in a disaster. So there's various strategies out there that in our own sphere we can start to build on. And then I think becoming critical, informed readers and, building on our knowledge of how this is going to play out. It's interesting that the International Federation is focusing so critically on this. So that is a really good lead for us to know that we have to get in there and understand it in our own context and build on our knowledge of this, but also assist the profession to become much higher profile in this space. So they're just a few things I would say. And then I guess closing, I'd say in all of this, be very conscious of gender, but, and other intersectional values that might shape people's experiences of disasters.
Nice summary there, Professor Alston. Just, some practical steps that individual workers and the wider profession can start to take, particularly around natural disaster response, increase the value of increasing our knowledge base on eco-social work practice and including differential gendered lens within that. And just generally that approach to taking a more joined up role, a more joined up active and engagement role within the profession more generally in relation to some of the stuff we've been talking about today. Look, it now just remains for me to close the interview. It's more than obvious to say, given your eminent experience, that it's been a privilege to talk with you today. I'm sure you've given our audience some stimulating ideas which can help inform their own thinking, help them start conversations on this subject of differential gendered experience, of environmental impacts and, the wider eco-social work principles to which they link in their own social work practice, with their friends, with their colleagues, within their employing organisations or in their professional associations. In the interim, it just remains for me, on behalf of householders' options to protect the environment, to thank you so much for your comments today.
Thank you.
You've been listening to a podcast episode in the series Eco-Social Work in Australia, produced for householders' options to protect the environment. Please consult the episode text notes for possible references to topics discussed and relevant contact details should you wish to respond to anything you've heard. My name is Andrew Nicholson, producer of the series, and thank you for listening.